Came in too. Good morning, Charles.
Good morning, Colleen. Good morning, everyone.
Good
Good morning,
morning.
Colette. How are you all?
Hey, I'm well. How you doing?
All right.
And Mr. Rodney, we see you. Can you hear us? Or we can see you that you're in okay. Okay. We can't hear you if you're there, Mr. Rodney, but we can see you and
Hear
we
me
know
now?
that. Oh, there we go. We got you.
Good
Excellent.
morning.
Good morning. And we have Mr. Larry Saraparu on. Hey, Mr. Larry, good morning. All right, I see you there. I know you're on mute, but I see your name. That means you're here. So says the computer. Excellent. All right. Well, welcome everyone. Lindsay's launching us onto the YouTube now, so just consider yourself live. And we're gonna give maybe just one more minute. I'm just looking to see. We know that Chief Sherrill had some business to do. I just want to make sure everybody got in okay. What about Liz and Ashley? Kendall, can you do me a favor and just do a quick text to Liz and Ashley? Make sure they have the link to come in. Thank you, dear. And everyone else, have one more sip of coffee before we get started. I heard PJ's was opening up stores in Alabama and Mississippi, so I'm feeling good about my travel across the South now. I can always get my PJ's coffee, which is delicious. Excellent. All right. Lindsay, how many minutes can we wait before we get started? Just to get, oh, there's Ashley.
No, let's wait maybe 1 or 2 more minutes. I know we're waiting on the people.
Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, Ashley. Good morning. You look beautiful. Good morning. We're already live on YouTube, so we're just holding for a couple more folks to join, and we'll get officially started in just a second here. Okay, great. All right. Yeah, the thing about Liz is that, when people have like little humans in them, I feel like they get a pass, the people with little humans and the people governing entire tribes of entire nations. These folks get passes on on 9:30 calls. So we'll see where we go. Well, let's go ahead and get started. We will welcome others in. We know that Chief Sherrill had a federal meeting where she has to represent her tribe today. So she's going to try to come in as able. And we know that Liz will join us as she is able. We saw Mr. Larry Saraparu try to get on. So I believe there's some technical challenges, but he's coming in and out. And we'll go ahead and get started. It is 9:32, and I'd like to officially call the meeting to order of the Equity Advisory Group for the Climate Initiatives Task Force. And good morning, everyone. I'm going to hand it over to Lindsay to just do a roll call so we can officially see who's here for the record. Lindsay, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Colette. Members, if you can unmute and state your name verbally for the record. Colette Pichon Battle.
Present.
Ashley Gardier.
Present.
Charles Allen.
Present.
Dr. Craig Colton. Dr. David Robinson Morris. I'll be running a few minutes. Jasmine Brown.
Present.
Dr. Kenny Cole. Let's see, Dr. Cole. Larry Saraparu. I don't see him either. Liz Russell.
Here.
Hey, Liz. Rodney Wallace.
Here.
Steve Sherrill, we know she'll be coming. And Steve Cochran.
Here.
Okay, great. Thank you, members.
Thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, members, and good morning again, everyone. Again, this is our Equity Advisory Group. This is our Actually, despite coming together many times, this is just our second time coming together as an equity advisory group, and we have been engaged and done a lot of work, and we have a lot more work to do. So just want to say welcome back. This is our space to really contemplate the details around equity, not just the philosophical details, but how we can practically apply equity into the recommendations that we know will be going to the governor. And it is our job as an advisory group to take the time to build out criteria and standards so that when these recommendations come from the different committees, we have some sort of lens or ability to assess how equity is being advanced. We know that equity is one of the main goals of this entire process. And so this is our job to carry that out. So we've got the good job and we've got the good team. And I'm just really excited to see everyone again. We want to make sure that folks are understanding that we're live on YouTube. We're requesting public participation, and there will be some space for that at the end. This is being recorded so that folks can go back and learn from some of the discussions that we're having. On today's meeting, we want to really take some time to finalize our definition of equity. So we're going to do a little workshopping today just on getting firm on our definition of climate equity so that it can be applied across the work over the next several months. We know we want to evaluate our process and start building out some of the criteria. And we know we want to just learn a little bit about some of the next steps. So today's session will run maybe about 2 hours, maybe a little more. We've got some time and space for that, but this is really going to be a working space for us today. So with that, let me just offer, we need to approve our minutes from our last meeting. You should have received the minutes, and I just want to ask for a motion to approve the minutes, and then we'll get down to some of the deeper parts of the agenda.
So moved.
Second. All right, we have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
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 Great. Any opposed? All right, any abstentions? Okay, so that motion carries. Thanks, members. So those minutes have been approved, and we will move forward with those. And next, I want to just shift us over to the definition of equity. We're missing a few of our members, and Mr. Rodney, you were not yet with us as we developed out this starting point on equity. So let me just remind folks that we took the time in our first meeting to really go around and hear from folks. What do you understand equity to be? How does this play out in your work? And we took the time. This is located in our notes. We took the time to really hear from folks. What are some of the main elements of equity that we wanted to advance? What we did not do was settle on a final definition, but what we did do is cultivate all of the elements. And now we want to take some time to put them together and finalize them. So we want to build on that December meeting of the definition of climate equity. And I also just want to ask you to remember and recall the presentation that Ashley and I were able to give at the February meeting. And Ashley, thanks again to you and the Policy Link for really bringing in that perspective. And I thought it was a really good start to what we know is going to be an in-depth process. So think about what we heard at the February meeting, think about what we were able to talk through in our December meeting, and really the work now is to land on a definition. So I'm going to ask, I believe there might be a slide or a definition we could put in the chat just for folks to actually see the words. And I'm going to take the time to read it out, but ask folks to really sort of hone in on the wording here. Now, we want to do some wordsmithing. This is the moment we want to do it. So now is the time for you to be your brilliant selves and help us make this work. And then we want to come to a conclusion today. So let's take some time to really talk through any questions that folks may have. So I'm just going to read out this draft definition, and then we will go from here. So the draft definition that we have is climate equity is a people-centered approach to addressing the global climate crisis, let's correct that spelling, through action that seeks to achieve long-term equality of outcomes by acknowledging historic harms to Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor communities, and by holding accountable those who benefit from the root causes of climate change. This is the definition we have. We put it together from all of the work that we started with. This is not our final definition. And so we really want to take some time to see where folks are. I just want to point out a few words. People-centered approach. The people-centered approach was really one of the spaces where we had a lot of conversation in the equity presentation, but also in our December meeting, just around this conversation around climate, not just being about the natural ecosystem, not just being about these things that are outside, but actually addressing the human part of this conversation. And so climate equity, really advancing a people-centered approach, is how we bring the human component into this conversation. I want to point out another a piece of wording here. It seeks to achieve equality, long-term equality of outcomes. Long-term equality of outcomes. This was our conversation around you can't just give everyone things equally. An equal distribution will not produce an equality of outcomes. It will produce, it will start off with an equality of dissemination, but the outcomes really depend on people's starting point. So I want to point that out. I also want to point out acknowledging historic harms. This was a deep conversation around understanding how solutions need to both address the current issue at hand, but address historic harms. This came up in a lot of different comments. There is a specific pointing out of Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor communities. This was all really based on an acknowledgement of Louisiana's history, Louisiana's future, and our reality, our current reality. And then there's a piece here about accountability to those who benefit from the root causes of climate change. This was where we had some discussion, actually. What does this accountability mean? Is this the right phrasing? And we want to talk about that today. So I wanted to point those pieces out for folks, and we want to just take some time now to see how folks would change this. How would you better this? And I want to just ask all the members to be solution oriented in their comments. So let me step back and see if there's anyone who would like to jump in here with some comments and changes, suggested changes. We've got Kendall Dix from the Gulf Coast Center for Law and Policy, who's just going to help track it on your screen. And we'll ask Kendall to go into suggesting mode. I believe it is there, and you'll see the changes. We can always go back. We can always make changes, but let's just give it a start. So who would like to jump in first? Yes, Dr. Colton, please.
Yeah, thank you. I was looking at a previous definition that did not have the term poor communities. I applaud you for adding that term. That's an excellent addition. I have two thoughts. One, acknowledging historical harms rather than historic. Historic implies significant events like, the bombing of Pearl Harbor. That's a historic event. Mm-hmm. Or all those many more common things that occur in the past. So I think historical might be a more appropriate term.
Yes.
And do we want to include in our acknowledgement of the historical harms to people with disabilities, to the infirm, to the aged? Do we want to include those communities? Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. I certainly don't have an objection. Let me just ask Kendall to please track historical with a suggestion, just so folks can see how we're shifting. And Black, Brown, Indigenous, and poor communities. There's a way to either group disabled or other groups, or we could list them out. Dr. Colton, do you have a suggestion on how we include this group?
Not any real specific way, other than just a couple of additional
listings.
The
Yeah.
aged and the disabled. Those would be the best terms to use, but there might be sensitive terms that we would prefer.
Okay. So we're going to add that in. Thank you, Kendall. Welcome, Councilman Saraparu, former Councilman Saraparu. Great to have you. We are just taking a look at our equity definition, and folks are just offering modifications to it. And so welcome on. We'll welcome you in whenever you have a comment. And let me just see if others have other modifications. Thank you, Dr. Colton. This was excellent. Liz, we'll go to you next. What are some of your thoughts?
Sure. First of all, thank y'all for all the work that you've done to try to consolidate what was a long and flowing conversation into this really great start for a definition. Thank y'all for your work. I really appreciate the linking together of the seeks to achieve long-term equality of outcomes. I think that's something that gets lost for a lot of folks sometimes, but I would also suggest acknowledging historical and institutionalized harms, because it's not so much just historical, right?
Mm-hmm.
But built into our policies and practices in ways that can be exacerbated unless we are intentional about acknowledging and reducing those harms. So that would be a suggestion.
Great. And I think this really gets to that, us understanding those structural racism, structural discrimination against gender, against aged, against disabled. So thank you. This is a great addition, Liz. Yeah.
I will say I don't yet see gender, if we're talking about gender there,
Mm-hmm.
It's not yet present. So
okay.
For me, that's something for the group to discuss.
Okay. So let's make a note on gender if there's not a direct suggestion, but thank you. We see the absence. So thank you for that, Liz. Others. So we're on the road here. Some changes are happening. Where are others? Anything to add? Yes, Steve.
I kind of feel like, Liz, there's a few groups that's not mentioned here.
Okay.
The Asians. I know there's a big Asian community that fish, and they do see it rough out there. So instead of labeling each individual group, is there a way that we could just capture everybody all at once, so we'll never forget anybody that we're not thinking about, like women or anything else like that?
I hear that. Thank you, Mr. Rodney. So how do we come up with a grouping word so that we don't have to list, or so that when we list folks out, we're not missing anyone? Our Asian community, a major community for us in Louisiana. We want to make sure that they're included in here. And the suggestion is, let's try to find it, but we don't have a direct suggestion on how to do it. But I'm hearing that where we have Black, Brown, Indigenous, poor, and disabled, how do we include more folks, gender, and Asian communities as well? I see a note here. Thank you, Mr. Rodney. We're going to figure that out, but this is good. Both gender and Asian communities and Fisher folk listed as a note. Let's keep working on this. Steve, let's go to you, certainly for any solutions or any suggestions you might have.
So I just wanted to call something out, because as I'm looking at this, I'm trying to think about how do we operationalize this, right? How do we engage with the range of policy options that we're going to be presented with? And so the one word I wanted to call out was I wanted to make sure that we were clear about it being there, was the word action, which is different than just acknowledging the existence of. It means actually doing something. And so I just want to call that out to make sure that we're purposeful there. If we're not, we should say so. If we are, then I want us to be clear about that as we communicate this to the range of other actors that will be interacting with as we go forward here.
And so do we have, that's a really great note here. Do we have a change, crisis Addressing the global climate crisis through action. Maybe we could literally say the words, addressing the global climate crisis not only through acknowledgement and action, or there is acknowledgement down at the bottom, you know, a little bit later.
It's there. I guess I'm anticipating the discussions that we'll have going forward, and I just want to. We're going to be people-centered. If we're going to be action-centered, we need to be clear that we are that. And I should be, but I just wanted to make that clear.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Great. And I want everyone to really sort of hear this point, you know, because I think the anticipation that I'm at least hearing is we don't just have a stagnant definition that can be applied. We have work. We have work to do. This achieving equity is going to take real engagement here, not just sort of this is equity, you know, a sort of formulaic thing. So thank you for that, Steve. An important piece of conversation that I think we should all be ready for. Just so folks can see, there are notes being taken on the side, so we'll get there. But let me just ask if there are any more modifications to the definition itself, any additions? Do you see something missing? Is there a different way of saying something? I love the way Dr. Colton, you know, made it grammatically correct and true, right? Any other changes like that from folks? Okay. Charles, how you feeling about this? It's okay for you for us to move on what we have here?
It's simmering.
Okay. That's fair.
And simmering in a good way. Don't worry. I'm also trying to see what kind of and you kind of spoke to this earlier, Colette, what kind of all-encompassing terms we use. So I'm actually searching it right now.
Excellent. Thank you for that. I think that's gonna help a lot if we get that suggestion. Thank you, Charles. Jasmine, how you feeling about this? Is this simmering for you as well? Is there anything sort of standing out for you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I love that Steve brought up action, because that's where I was really hung up on. I know that, you know, oftentimes when we think about equity, as you said, this is not just about defining what we think the framework should look like, but it's really about the work that will make this framework come to life. So the action piece was very, very important to me. And I also really appreciate Liz's addition of institutionalized. I think that's really, really important, because it definitely goes beyond the historical context. Y'all know and appreciate. So
that's right. Thank you for that. Good to hear. Good to hear you're okay with that. Ashley, how are you feeling about where we are so far? Anything missing from what you're thinking about, and specifically thinking about your presentation and the way you were able to talk about equity? Is there anything that glaring for you from this definition?
No, it feels good. I'm most appreciative of the long-term equality of outcomes piece, that it feels like a learning opportunity for folks who are less familiar with the equity conversation, that it's not just about, dissemination, but those outcomes. So this feels good.
Excellent, thank you. And I see a note in here for Mr. Rodney in the chat, an all-encompassing term of marginalized people. When we were talking about coming up with terms that include Black, Brown, Indigenous, poor, disabled, women, Asian, fisher folks, Mr. Rodney's suggestion is marginalized people. How do folks feel about that as a suggestion? Yeah, Charles Allen was leaning also toward marginalized. It's descriptive. It's also not victimizing, right? It marginalized really sort of addresses a targeting or some sort of outside action that is not just about poor individual choices, but about that systemic and institutional reality that Liz was talking about.
That's what I was also thinking as well. I want to be respectful. I don't want to be All that you just said, Madam Chair Lady.
and Dr. Colton is also coming in saying he's comfortable with that term too, that respectful but encompassing. We know there are many groups that we want to make sure are understand, but for this definition, we need to be able to take this definition and put it on top of the broader work. So this is good. Let's see. So a suggestion is by acknowledging historical and institutional harms to marginalized people, or to marginalized, maybe we can say communities, marginalized communities. Any objection to that, Mr. Rodney, to say communities instead of people? Or maybe we should say people.
One of the two.
Okay, one of the two. I'll take it. When we say marginalized people, it could be very individualized. When we say marginalized communities, it could be more of a grouping. I'm curious if folks have any strong feelings about that one way or the other. But that would be the shift here, from listing out Black, Brown, Indigenous, poor, disabled, women, Asian, and fisher folk to marginalized communities or marginalized people.
Is it too much to consider including both? Maybe that's repetitive, but to say marginalized people and communities?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's do that and see how folks react. So marginalized people and communities. Yep. Great. All right. I saw a thumbs up from Dr. Colton. That's good. All right. Mr. Saraparu, so glad to have you join us. This is really a sort of workshopping day. We are developing our definition on climate equity because the Equity Advisory Group's charge will really be to look at a lot of the recommendations that are coming up from the committees and really put this definition both on top of those recommendations, but also as a guide to the criteria that we want to develop. So this is an important, little bit tedious piece, but it will inform the rest of where we're going. Just want to make some space for you, see how you're feeling about what we have so far. I'm going to read it just one more time, just so folks can hear all of the changes. Climate equity is a people-centered approach to addressing the global climate crisis through action that seeks to achieve long-term equality of outcomes by acknowledging historical and institutionalized harms to marginalized people and communities, and by holding accountable those who benefit from the root causes of climate change. That's where we are right now. Any changes from you or any feedback from you, Mr. Larry, on this definition? Let's get you unmuted first. I see you talking. I know you're there. I saw your lips moving. All right. And if you want to move your cursor down to the bottom left of your screen. Oh, I see somebody helping. Gotta love the help. Whenever I'm on technology, I have to call my 11-year-old niece, is all I'm saying. All right.
Yes, thank you. And listen, there's no right or wrong way for this statement. I think it's all bold and to the point.
Okay. All right. Great. Thank you, Mr. Larry. To the point. That's where we like to be. Great. So we've got a starting point here. Now let's just take a little time. So I think we've cleared the comment around gender and fisher folk. We settled that one with marginalized. So that part is good. Let's see what else. Yeah, these were all about the listings. We we corrected historical to be grammatically correct, added institutionalized. So that part is there. Lots of things were agreed to, seconded. Where we didn't really is the action comment that Steve brought in. We need, we're noting it in this conversation. Is there anything we need to add or change here? Climate equity is a people-centered approach to addressing the global climate crisis through action that seeks to achieve long-term equality of outcomes. Is there anything more that we need to say here in this action piece? Is there anything more that we need to be clear about? Okay. Great. And I see we have Dr. Robinson also joining us. So excited to have you. Thank you for joining in. We're just looking at this definition of equity. We've taken some of the information we cultivated from our December meeting that you contributed to. So good to have you back. But we also took a little bit of our learning from the equity presentation. And we've just been taking some detailed notes on grammatical and more detailed changes just to get us to a final definition today. So please take your time with it. If there are any comments, folks are putting comments both in the chat and verbally. So thank you for joining us. All right, y'all, we've got a starting definition now. Yes, Ashley, please.
I apologize. I at least want to just acknowledge the trade-off between marginalized as a group and the calling out of specific populations. I'm okay with where we are landing, except I'm noticing in this time in our country when everybody's divided, there's even a competition for who's marginalized, right? So I just, I am comfortable with our intention, and I'm recognizing that the trade-off is the interpretation. You know, it leaves room for interpretation. And at a time where we're seeing everybody's feeling marginalized. And so the only other thing, and I apologize, I don't have a solution yet, is one tool that helps us to unpack is the data, like really being able to be clear about what we mean by marginalized in this space. That's also true for, you know, kind of an evidence-based approach to historical and perhaps even institutionalized. So I wanted to name it, and I'm sorry I don't have a solution to offer quite yet, but that's what I'm still wrestling with. It's not a challenge about the words or our intent, but just that they can be defined in other spaces differently.
Yeah, I think that is a fair and necessary point to bring out, especially in this moment in our country where we're seeing sort of, you know, different folks take those labels and apply them to themselves. Let me ask, and this is just a real question. How about outcomes by acknowledging institutionalized harms to historically marginalized people? Meaning it sort of doesn't allow for the newer, or it mitigates the newer assertions of marginalization and goes back to a historic marginalization. That's a suggestion. I wonder where folks feel. I also saw Liz, you ready to jump in, and come on in. And yeah, Charles, I see you off. Are you on stack, Charles? Okay, well. Okay.
I don't want to disrupt this conversation because I have a comment on another part, so I can hold.
Okay, we'll come back to you, Liz. Thanks. Let's try to hone in on this. Charles, would you like to come in on this?
Madam Chair, I also appreciate your suggestion there because it brings it back to the people, and in this case, the marginalized people, and the historically. And again, you know, that to me, that causes us all to then, you know, do our work and research. Who are historically marginalized people, you know? So I appreciate how your term there pushes us back to the people, you know.
Great. Thank you for that, Charles. Any other comments on, yeah, Ashley?
I'm also hoping, you know, in this moment, there's also a fear with the demographic shift that there's just going to be a turning of the tables. So I'm clear that that's some of what folks are holding, which is why there's an attempt to broaden this definition of marginalized. I'm hoping, though, that the language about long-term equality of outcomes is a signal that we still are focused on everyone, right? It's not, you know, switching who's in charge. It's that we actually want everyone to win.
Yes.
So I just wanted to name that if there were questions later that we'd all feel comfortable do we feel comfortable that equality of outcomes gets to the all, that we strive for.
I hear that. I hear that question. As we are honing in on marginalized and making sure that we're including marginalized, is this definition clear enough for all Louisianians to see that the intent here is that everybody be okay? And is this strong enough? Is this good enough? Thank you, Ashley. I think that is a great question. Jasmine, would you like to come in? Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Madam Chair. To Ashley's earlier point about the data and allowing the data to really explicitly define the groups that we are seeking to target, just a question around the data. Have we dissected which groups will potentially be impacted by this work? Very specific.
Great question. What does the data say about who's going to be impacted by the climate crisis? Who's going to be impacted by the recommendations of this task force? Who are we? Who is the, what is the data saying? And I think we got a little bit of that in the equity presentation where, just looking at, I know I presented on, the health and the racial wealth divide, right? You could really see that in the national racial wealth divide, Black communities were at the very bottom, while white families were anticipated to make quadruple or more income, just as the years played out. The health outcomes or the poverty outcomes across the South in particular. And we know the definition around climate justice includes an acknowledgement that people who will suffer first and worst are the people who contribute the least to the emissions that are accelerating the climate crisis. It may be important for us to include that, right? To include a little, like I think Ashley was saying that as well, like who do we mean by marginalized? Like we might need a little bit of a, this is who we're talking about. And I wonder too, Jasmine, if, what are those, what is the reality? Like we might need to include that as well.
Absolutely. And I really do, while I understand the appreciation of wanting to include everyone, I do appreciate the specificity that is supported by the data so that there is no room for misinterpretation.
Okay. All right. I like that. Thank you for that. And we wanted to take just about 20 minutes here. So let's get some final comments and then we will move to just going deeper into our evaluation process. But let's see where we can land. Dr. Robinson, would you like to comment?
Sure. Sorry that I was late and thank you for those welcoming remarks. I would raise 2 points. One is people-centered, right? Which makes it very andro. And, perhaps it's people-focused, planet-centered. I don't know how to word that, but something about that in my is like getting me caught up. It is people-centered, right? But and then the inclusion of the word vulnerable or most vulnerable, because that's what we're really trying to get at, right? Yes, they're historically marginalized, but that doesn't always equal the most vulnerable populations, right, to this crisis.
And where can we, I appreciate that comment, where could a suggestion be specifically for inclusion of the word vulnerable?
Let's see.
Institutionalized harms to historically marginalized people and communities.
And maybe it's and vulnerable communities.
I see. Yes, historically marginalized people and vulnerable communities. Okay, I see a few nods here. Any objection to this addition? This is an addition of a new word here. Just want to get some feedback.
I love that.
I got a question about vulnerable. Whenever we talk about vulnerable, when Katrina came, to me, everybody was a victim of Katrina. I don't care who you were. Yeah, some people were able to overcome it a little bit better, but when we talk about vulnerable, what do we really mean when we talk about vulnerable when it comes to the issue of climate?
And I think this is probably Dr. Robinson Morris's point. There is the vulnerable population that I think Jasmine was really pointing to, right? There are the folks who are sort of on this front line who have these statistical, there's statistical proof of who they are, right? They don't have the resources, they don't have the access, they don't have whatever, that's vulnerable. But I think there's a bigger point here, Mr. Rodney, which is climate change has made South Louisiana quite vulnerable, all of us. and it might not be a label that many people of privilege understand for themselves, but as a geography, as a state, we are quite vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And so I think using the word might get us to two groups of people: the folks who we understand through statistics to be vulnerable, but also a new understanding of our reality as folks who live in Louisiana, as part of a global reality that puts our state a little bit in the bullseye, like other places. So I think this could be a double meaning: vulnerable for the specific and vulnerable for the new understanding of a climate reality that has our region quite vulnerable. Is there an objection, Mr. Rodney? Just an explanation. This could be another one of those explanations that we include along with marginalized and along with people-centered. Is there an objection to the word vulnerable?
No, not at all. Just
Okay.
clarification. It almost looks like a red situation where you're using marginalized and vulnerable, which I would say climate-wise, you're dealing with the same deal.
I hear that. And thank you for that. I also don't hear an objection, and I haven't seen any objections to the inclusion, just some clarifications around what we mean. So we'll make that note. Yep, Dr. Colton?
I'm curious if we want to phrase it this way, where we say marginalized people and then vulnerable communities. Suggests that you don't have more vulnerable people and you don't have marginalized communities. Might we think about taking vulnerable and moving it towards the end of the sentence, saying something to the effect, and by holding accountable those who benefit from the root causes of climate change that disproportionately impact vulnerable communities?
Yes, we can definitely put that in. So let's see, Kendall will add that in for us. We still have the word vulnerable. Dr. Robinson Morris, I certainly want to get your opinion on how we bring in vulnerable back, because we were just looking for a place to put the word vulnerable. And I think Dr. Colton is offering a new location for the word. And let's see how this looks.
Maybe, let me rephrase that one time. Saying that disproportionately impact the most vulnerable. So we don't repeat communities.
Got it. The most vulnerable and take out communities. Yeah. Got it. So we'll delete the last word communities, and then we will have a new definition. Let's try it. Let's try it on. Climate equity is a people-centered approach to addressing the global climate crisis through action that seeks to achieve long-term equality of outcomes by acknowledging institutionalized harms to historically marginalized people and communities, and by holding accountable those who benefit from the root causes of climate change that disproportionately impact the most vulnerable. Dr. Robinson Morris, let me just check in with you on shifting the word vulnerable to that second part of the sentence.
I think it gets at it a little bit better.
Excellent.
Yeah, thank you for
excellent. That. Thank you, and thank you, Dr. Colton. Any objections to this shift? Yeah, Steve?
Well, it highlights the other two words here. I raised earlier the issue of action, not to challenge it, but to highlight it. I think the holding accountable is the other phrase that I think we ought to be clear about what that will be a subject of conversation as we go forward, and that we get clear, and particularly in this sense, as we've added to the sort of rhetorical flourish about why holding accountability is morally appropriate. But I want to. I think it's important that we talk about that here so that we are clear as we prepare for these discussions going forward.
All right. Well, let's do that. Let's talk about holding accountable. And Liz, I know you were also waiting to shift away. If there are other comments about the marginalized piece or the vulnerable piece, please come in with that. But let's also move to some other spaces, the holding accountable clause. And Liz, you were also going to bring in another piece.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I do want to acknowledge with the vulnerable conversation that I know some folks can feel as though that is a victimization in terms of calling vulnerable, as opposed to people self-identifying as vulnerable. And so I just, there could be a larger conversation there, but I'm comfortable with how we've put it into this definition and appreciate the nuance. I did want to mention a little bit to Steve's point. For me, the last clause, we could actually pull apart a few phrases and learn more of what we mean in order to be better prepared for the conversations to come. I think both in terms of holding accountable, but also those who benefit. What do we mean by that? And then also the root causes. What do we mean by that? Which I think we dove into in the last discussion, but I think I just wanted to bring those to the fore because we haven't really discussed this phrase yet. That how we actualize that component of the definition in the climate task force, it feels really important. And so just really having a better shared understanding about what we mean by accountability, what we mean by benefits, and what we mean by the root causes.
And so we can revisit some of those meanings. Remember, we came to these words because we cultivated this sort of up and out. But I hear the point being, as we finalize this definition, let us make sure that we are all on board with what we mean. So let's take them one by one. Let's actually go with the root causes of climate change. Let's go to root causes first. And for root causes, there was really a conversation around the role of Louisiana, its industry, its economy in this global climate conversation. What we know from the presentation from the first climate task force is that it is the emission of greenhouse gases into our atmosphere that is accelerating the climate crisis. We understand that many of the fossil fuel based industries are releasing some of the largest amounts of greenhouse gases. And we understand that Louisiana is a leader in the fossil fuel based industry and economy in the United States. We have not only a regional reality and role here, but a global one. And so the root causes of climate change were really rooted in conversations around our economy and our industry. But there are also conversations around extraction as an economic philosophy, right? So not just fossil fuels, but the industry that existed in the South before fossil fuels, which was a slave economy rooted in mass agriculture, that getting to Dr. Robinson's point, just about talking about people-centered, there was extraction from the natural resources and the earth long before we're starting to see the extraction of fossil fuels. So a deeper understanding of the root causes of climate change that start not just with fossil fuel extraction, but in an economy that existed long before then. These were some of the pieces of conversation we had before. I'm curious if others want to make sure that we highlight other points of root causes before we move to who benefits and who has benefited. Great. So just sort of acknowledging the conversation that we had, and let's just take a minute to talk about those who benefit. I mean, this really gets us to the opposite of who we were listing out, right? So we had originally listed Black, Brown, Indigenous, disabled, Asian, Fisher folks. That's who we had listed out. Who's not listed is really who we're talking about as the beneficiaries of this economy. And so we know that because of the history of this state and this nation, that white male identities were favored legally. Citizenship was rooted in that identity, and property ownership oftentimes in that identity. So we're dealing with a particular group of people who benefit, but others benefit. I have mentioned many times that my father worked in oil and gas. Many of us come from communities that work in the industry. So it's not only one group of people benefited from this. But there is something here that's a little nuanced, right? The benefits that I have received as a Black woman whose father worked in oil and gas, not exactly the same benefits that historically, generationally, a white male-led family has received in this society. So we got to be honest about those kinds of things, right? Privilege isn't the same across the board. It is accessible to many people, but not the same across the board. What are some other comments just around who benefits that we want to make sure we uplift? Charles? Yeah.
Madam Chair, you're speaking to me because I've had similar conversations within my own family, immediate and larger, around how, we within our very large Black family, multicolored family, we have benefited in ways that perhaps, when you look back on it, may not have been so good,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It doesn't mean that we can't, and it should not mean that we can't arrive at a moment in time where we all say, you know what? Maybe let's not revisit that. Maybe let's not do that again. Maybe let's not invest in such ways of life anymore. Let's learn from the experiences,
Yeah.
Conversations with people in my church around how white supremacy has messed us up as a people, okay? It has messed up a lot of different groups of people, okay? Learn from all of that. Let's not be held by the baggage of the past, So your comments there really resonate with me.
Thank you for that, Charles. Let's learn from the past. Let's not do things the same. I think this is actually a really relevant comment to equity, right? Because what we're going to see is, especially, we saw how hard change was with Katrina. We know the difficulties that we'll touch on when the word change comes, or the word transition or transformation comes in. But I think Charles brings up a great point. Let's not do it the way we did it before. Let's learn from some of these hard lessons. Let's acknowledge what we need to acknowledge, and let's go forward in a different way. Thank you for that, Charles. Liz?
Yeah, I really appreciate the nuance of this conversation, because I think there's a lot of us on the call that likely have connections to the industries that benefit, right? My granddad worked for oil and gas and have a lot of ties to the maritime industry, which is obviously, serviced. I want to also, though, acknowledge the people who benefit, as I think back to the video of why Louisiana stays so poor. And the reality that we the natural resources of this place have not always been even procured to the benefit of the people of the place, right? And so there's something there for me in terms of like where revenue goes that is produced through the extraction of fossil fuels and or extractive thinking generally, right? You're inherently pulling something out of a place and distributing it elsewhere. And so for me, there's just a bigger, those who benefit, that is also tied to the need for Louisianans to see themselves as see ourselves as worthy of benefits. I don't know, and be able to ensure that what benefits are produced by, the things in our communities benefit the people in our communities. I don't know. I don't know what this is not exactly solutions oriented, Madam Chair, so I apologize. But
no, I think it's good. I think it's good because I think we'll need to talk about benefits, and it looks like we'll need to talk about a few more things, y'all. And this is okay. It's okay. This is the process. The only reason I'm going to pause this conversation is just in the interest of time. But Lindsay, I wanted to ask the governor's staff, could you give us, Charles has asked a great question. When is our deadline for finalizing the definition? Can you give us any sort of time frame? Do we have some time to finish this and then present the final definition at our next meeting, having done some work in between time?
You can have as much time as you would need to workshop this. I would say we're going into this first round of evaluation between mid-April and mid-May, and it would be wonderful even to have a workshop draft definition so that we can send out to other advisory members when they're evaluating climate equity to have an idea of what you all would like them to evaluate against with this definition in mind.
Okay.
So I foresee that it's entirely all right if it's in draft form still, but this has been a wonderful discussion.
Thank you, Lindsay. This really has been a wonderful discussion, and I don't see changes in the wording, y'all. What we're doing right now is we're explaining words that are here. And so what we have is a workshop definition that we can make sure that we have, that the task force and other committees see, and we can continue the conversation to parse things out. Let me see if there are any objections to that approach. Any objections to us being able to move with the wording that we have and continue to workshop as a group? Yeah, thank you, Charles. Great. Okay, thank you, Dr. Colton. All right.
I do think that this learning, yes, draft workshop definition and the conversation that we had, if there was like an appendix or an unpacking of the language, is helpful learning for everyone.
So let's take that, and I'm just going to ask Kendall to make a note of that. Let's make an appendix. There were several pieces that Jasmine mentioned, Dr. Robinson Morris mentioned, Liz mentioned, Steve mentioned that we should parse out a little bit. We have a definition, but what do we mean by this? And that appendix can accompany it. So I think that's a great suggestion, Ashley. Thank you so much. And thanks, everyone. What a great discussion on a definition of equity. Interestingly enough, many cities and states that are building their climate work and addressing equity are doing the same process. So thank you. Great work. Louisiana will continue to be a leader in pushing some of these things out. Let's move now. We're a little bit behind, but I think we can make it up with just some learning and conversation around our evaluation process and really get an understanding of the strategy portfolios. So let me turn it back over to Lindsay to just do a little bit of learning on what's coming next.
Thank you, Chairwoman, for leading us through that wonderful discussion. And members, I really appreciate your transparency and willingness to work with us in building out that definition. I think it will be not only helpful to this group in defining how you all evaluate, but also for all of our other groups in the task force as they understand what equity means in this work. So if you all can share, or if you all can see my shared screen, I'm going to move forward through a brief presentation. I'll try and make it pretty quick on what this evaluation process is. We're finally starting to engage you all in your advisory role, and I know we've all waited a long time for it, so it's exciting to be here. And just to kick us off, I wanted to frame some desired outcomes for this meeting of what we want to get from this, so you all, as we go throughout the next few steps, you can kind of track where we want to end up. So I'll walk you through the process to evaluate potential impacts of some hypothetical scenarios of how Louisiana can reduce emissions. And we're going to do that evaluation through a consequence analysis so that you all, hopefully my goal is that you all will understand the process that we'll go through in this analysis. And then we'll spend a few minutes in another working session getting input from you all on how we will do this evaluation. So on building out evaluation criteria from an equity lens that would be informative to you all and the other groups. And then I'll share some next steps on this analysis and on the action development process that's currently going on at the sector committee level. They're working on their actions. So just to frame where you all are going in the next month or so with our meetings, I know there's a lot going on this spring for all of our groups, and just appreciate your continued work with us throughout this process. But to frame on the left side, in this late March meeting, we're beginning to develop criteria that will inform how we evaluate potential impacts of different emission reduction scenarios. And the goal is to understand this analysis process and provide input on criteria. And then in mid-April, you all will cross over to the action development process going on with the committees. And we'll do this through a series of cross-sector, cross-disciplinary workshops. As I noted in my email earlier this week to everyone, these will be around April 14th through 16th. And our goal there is just to provide feedback to help refine select action proposals. And we'll take the work that you all do in this meeting and over the next 2 weeks around evaluation criteria to build a survey for you all to evaluate these emission reduction scenarios, and then send a survey to you all in mid-April as well. And by late April, we would love to just hold an office hours time to discuss any questions that you all or other advisory members have on answering these surveys and completing this and understanding how to evaluate the emission reduction scenarios against our objective. So the goal there is just to have an open forum for questions on completing the survey. So this is where we're going moving forward, but I just wanted to start by taking a step back actually to the vision of this effort. That Louisiana will reduce its emissions to limit the worst impacts of climate change and improve the welfare of residents and the environment while maintaining our position as a leader in various industries. And this is just getting us to think about outcomes in this effort. So we want to be focused on where we're going moving forward. And with that vision that the governor set forth, he also set forth the task force and these emission reduction goals as our central math problem to solve. But getting to these goals will require some degree of transformative change. So what else matters to Louisiana and how we make these changes to reach these goals? So this kind of gave way for the process in the first few months of this effort to define what else does matter and how we reach our goals. And this is what we have deemed as our fundamental objectives, the draft objectives that you all talked through in your first meetings, as well as the committees and the task force has spoken around a few times. And we found that these following areas or categories, and there are a few objectives within each, so we have a total of 16 objectives. But we've also found that improving quality of life, creating a more equitable society, managing success, strengthening the economy and workforce, conserving natural resources and the environment, and adapting to a changing climate are also very important in how we meet our climate mitigation goals. And you all as advisory members will be evaluating potential scenarios to reducing our emissions in terms of how they impact these fundamental objectives. So ultimately, at this stage in our planning process, our big question is, what does the future of Louisiana look like under different scenarios for reducing emissions, both in terms of how this impacts our greenhouse gas reduction measures and goals, but also how it impacts our fundamental objectives that are just as important to us in driving this process. But there are a lot of approaches and scenarios by which we can reduce our emissions. And just to briefly revisit our structured decision making, this process is really a way to systematically question, evaluate, understand, and communicate the impact of these different approaches based on what matters most to us, our fundamental objectives. And this is to help the task force make an informed decision about what actually does go forth in our climate plan next February. So as I mentioned before, our goal is to stay focused on outcomes and to provide mechanisms to incorporate the input from you all, from our other advisory groups and committees and task force and the public as we move throughout the phases of this process. So you all as advisory members will play a central role in forecasting what consequences might occur if we choose different approaches to reducing emissions. So we want to understand potential impacts of some different approaches. And this is the step that we're beginning to take today. And in this planning process, we want to understand the potential impacts across a variety of approaches twice this year. So this first round is in March through May, what we're kicking off today at the higher level to get a bigger picture view of the future. And then we'll come back and we'll do another round of evaluation in August and September, bringing in those more refined details of the actions that committees are developing now and the public is developing as well, bringing in those more specific details to create these broader sets of portfolios. And we're going to present these approaches to you all as portfolios, which are basically just a group of alike strategies that you'll be able to evaluate through 2 rounds of what we're calling our consequence analyses. And so today kicks off our first round of analysis. And as I mentioned, our goal with this round is really to understand broad impacts of hypothetical scenarios. So seeing some big picture views at the strategy level. And just to dive into what we mean by strategy right there, the sector committees have all met over the past 2 weeks, and they've refined their strategies in their working session and have begun to build out their actions that kind of fit within the strategies. And so we're taking the strategies that committees have developed. We're basically going to fit them in under different portfolios that represent these hypothetical emission reduction scenarios. So possibly workshopping language a little bit and gap filling, but using their work to inform building these portfolios. So ultimately, the goal in this first round is to broadly understand impacts to objectives across all of these portfolios and be able to have structured conversations with the Climate Task Force this summer around setting priorities. And then, as I mentioned in that second round, coming back to evaluate at the action level, folding in that action development process that's currently going on with our committees, and where we can add in those more refined details and have a deeper level of evaluation. So this is just to set the tone of the evaluation we're doing now and in the future and show you what it might be looking like that you will evaluate. So to dive into this first round a little bit further, I find it's helpful to start by framing the goals of why are we doing this and where do we want to get with this first round. So we really want to provide a structured way for advisory groups to weigh in on important considerations in how Louisiana reduces our emissions and what are the anticipated impacts of different scenarios. So there are 3 things that we want to frame for the task force. And the first one is not bolded and starred because this more so comes in the second analysis that we'll do in August and September, but understanding the realistic limits of strategies towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And this will be informed by our updated greenhouse gas inventory and pathway modeling. But I highlight the 2 pieces below for you all that through this evaluation process, we want to frame for the task force potential impacts of these different portfolios on our other objectives and what considerations are necessary to have positive outcomes for our people, our economy, and our environment. So with those goals in mind, now I think we can talk about what we will evaluate. And then I'll talk to you all about how we'll do the evaluation. But looking at what first, we'll frame and prepare and package multiple, probably around 3 to 6 different portfolios of strategies that represent intentionally hypothetical future scenarios for you all to evaluate in this first round. So as I mentioned, right now what we're grappling with is the future of Louisiana under different emission reduction scenarios. So this is the way that we'll organize portfolios in this first round. We'll focus now on these high-level strategies, these high-level paths for reducing emissions. And our committees have developed a lot of strategies. So it's important to find a way to group them so you all, I think we have around 120 different strategies. So being able to group them under alike bins as portfolios will really help to evaluate these more smoothly too and understand how the pieces begin to fit together. And in this round, we intentionally frame these extreme alternative approaches to see what would just happen if we turn all the knobs on of what we can possibly do and try to understand what is the most that we can achieve from a potential scenario. And so I frame these two example scenarios on this slide, a business as usual slide first, business as usual case first, and then a renewable energy and electrification. And these are draft portfolio options. We haven't finalized what the scenarios look like yet. But in this first one, what would happen if we just do business as usual? We don't change anything to reduce our emissions and nothing is implemented. How does that impact our emissions, and how does that impact our other fundamental objectives compared to how things are now? And this is a really important portfolio to consider because things won't stay the same over 30 years, no matter what. So it's important to understand the consequence of inaction as well. But if we take another example of a portfolio, such as renewable energy and electrification, and we just turn it all the way on and try to understand what the limit of net emission reduction is that can be achieved if we pursue electrification and renewables to the fullest extent, and what are the positive and negative impacts on our objectives if we have this fully electrified future that's powered by renewables. So these are two examples of the hypothetical scenarios that we'll frame for you in that survey that I mentioned, just to understand the most of what we can achieve and the potential impacts of that. And we'll probably frame, as I mentioned, around 3 to 6 of these for you all. And you'll have strategies underneath these portfolios to inform the evaluation that you do. And I would just say that the goal is not for the task force to pick one portfolio. We know that one hypothetical scenario is obviously not our solution, but rather this is an exercise to understand bigger picture implications of different approaches and begin to help the task force set priorities as they move into the summer. I also think this will be informative in the action development process as well. So there's a lot of benefit of just taking these hypothetical future scenarios as our first look through on the evaluation process. And the last thing I'll mention on this slide is we, as I mentioned, we haven't finalized the portfolios yet, but we will be sending this to you in mid-April alongside the tool for evaluation. And this leads well into how we will evaluate. So tackling the how of evaluation, we will evaluate against our fundamental objectives. And I've mentioned a few times that it's really important in this transparent and data-driven process that advisory groups provide direct input on the impacts and considerations of potential benefits and concerns around different scenarios. So we frame for each of our advisory groups some different groups of objectives that they will evaluate. But when considering equity, I believe, and in concert with our chairwoman, believe that equity should evaluate across all of these objectives. Equity is important in considering improving quality of life and long-term success and a changing climate as it is in the more equitable society ones. So you all will be evaluating across all of our fundamental objectives, which might mean more homework for you all, but I think we'll prove to have very successful results in our evaluation. And just to keep framing our process a little bit, we're going to evaluate those intentionally hypothetical scenarios, as I mentioned, organized as those strategy portfolios against our objectives through a survey that we will send to you all in mid-April. And this will have an opportunity to score how each of these scenarios impacts each individual objective and also leave some space for considerations at the bottom of each evaluation. So you can note on the right side of this screen, providing a score is not a numerical score. It's probably going to be on a very positive to very negative scale or a very high to very low scale, and then having the space for considerations of what key concerns might be of this portfolio impacting a certain objective. And the narrative portion will be the most important part to synthesize. And we really want to use this as a mechanism to get all of your input, not just through that initial impact score, but also through the considerations. So all of our advisory members will be sent the same survey, but asked to evaluate different objectives. As we design the survey between now and then, over the next 2 weeks or so, 2 or 3 weeks, one of the key things will be developing evaluation criteria for each of our objectives that everyone uses consistently as guidance in filling out the survey. And there will be a unique scale for each of our 16 fundamental objectives to identify how we should evaluate the objective. So let's take this example that I have on the screen of one of our objectives is maximizing preservation of natural resources and ecosystem services. And so some criteria that would help us evaluate this objective is overall net productivity of fisheries, acreage of wetlands that mitigate storm impacts, acreage of natural areas for outdoor activities. And this is not comprehensive criteria, but just a few examples of what might guide us in that evaluation. And creating consistent criteria is very important because the way I look at evaluating this objective is likely very different from how you all would look at this objective, even compared to one another. So having the standard way of evaluation will just enhance the ability to process and synthesize the work of the surveys through this. So again, our goal is to create a unique scale for each of these objectives and create consistent criteria. So we want you all to not only do this work of the evaluation, but also help us in developing criteria by identifying key considerations that others might not be aware of in considering outcomes. And so we'll get our feet wet with this today and start in today's meeting, developing just a few components of what evaluation criteria might look like. But then this is kind of your homework moving forward over the next 2 weeks to help us continue to consider what criteria might look like. And Steve, I see your hand raised. Let me get one more slide forward and then I'll gladly stop for some questions. So just to put all of this in context, this survey in mid-April will score those hypothetical scenarios in their organized portfolios using our evaluation criteria, really highlighting the significance of that short narrative, summarizing key concerns. And so with that, I will take a break here. And Steve, I'd be glad to answer your question or any other questions from the room.
A fairly narrow question. When on the survey, or I guess when you're sending out, are all the individual people going to answer that, or is that going to be done by committee? In other words, do we evaluate a recommendation from a working committee as an advisory committee, or is everybody going to fill that out individually?
You will do that individually. So we'll send to each person the same survey, and you all evaluating across the objectives will fill out the survey yourself. And then we'll synthesize the work that you all have done to evaluate.
Thanks.
Yes, Liz.
Thanks, Lindsay. And you may be getting to this, but I just am curious because these objectives could be more nuanced in some cases, right? They're quite broad and in some cases quite vague. And so reviewing them is fine. But for me, I wonder how they relate to the recommendations that the different committees are putting forward. And are we going to be reviewing those recommendations as well and in a similar format? And again, forgive me if I'm jumping ahead in any way. I'm just curious about how the different pieces fit together.
No, not a problem at all, Liz. That's a great question to raise. So the committees are working through the more specific action development to help us meet our emission reduction goals. And our fundamental objectives are also geared towards what else is important in meeting those goals. So being able to evaluate the strategies now and then the actions later on will help us understand the impact of those actions against our objectives, if that's informative to your first question. And then on your second question, in that second round of analysis, we'll be fitting in the actions that are being developed by the committees, but knowing now they're still in the middle of their action development process, and we don't want to take anything before it's ready to be put forward from the committees to evaluate. So we'll be incorporating their work as we move forward, again, in that second round of evaluation.
Okay, thanks for that.
Any further questions on these components? Okay, great. I'll just finish up with a few more slides and open us into our working session on developing this criteria. And so what to expect in this analysis today, we'll begin to build out what that evaluation criteria looks like taking a look at those equitable society objectives, just one set of what you will be asked to evaluate. And then over the course of the next 2 weeks, having the ability for you all to continue to provide me and Colleen with input on evaluation criteria for any of the other 16 fundamental objectives. And in mid-April, we will take all of the criteria and synthesize the input that we've gotten from members across all of our advisory groups, and then build this survey that will go out to you all alongside those hypothetical scenarios. And that's the opportunity to provide a score on each of the portfolios and then some input in the form of a short narrative of considerations on that objective. And I would just say as well, to Liz's point, you might find that these strategy portfolios, these hypothetical scenarios are at a very high level, and it's challenging to evaluate them against our objectives. And it might depend on implementation. It might depend on what actions fall under that strategy. And there might be some considerations that have gaps. And to the extent that we can, we'll provide a few notes on assumptions in each of the scenarios. But what we really want to focus on is that short narrative of why does this depend, or what is necessary to consider before the task force could make a decision on pursuing this path forward, or why does this particular portfolio score so negatively? Why is it very negative across all of our equity objectives? So having that space to explain why it depends, or why it's negative or positive or neutral, is what we would really like to highlight. That will be very helpful for us, for the task force, and again for that action development process, so that as they begin to refine their actions, they're aware of considerations that you all have raised as concerns at this point in the process earlier. And again, this last note on the slide is in August and September, we'll do a second round of this consequence analysis with these actions included. So in a way, this round is helping us to get our feet wet, to understand the evaluation, to work through some of the criteria, and to enhance as we need to moving into that second round, because that's what will really include the actions and move forward for creating that climate report for next year. And so as we transition into this working session, I just had a few considerations for you all to keep in mind in developing criteria, beginning to think about what it would be a meaningful outcome of this objective. What criteria would be a helpful outcome to measure for this objective? And then what does success or failure look like? What is a benchmark of this objective? And keeping in mind that this should have a clear relationship to the objective itself and does not need to be comprehensive. We're looking to put forth maybe 4 to 5 really important factors to guide evaluation, and not necessarily listing 10 to 15, because then it might get a little confusing and hard to score at that point at a high level. And so we need the help from you all in developing what those important factors are. And I would say particularly around equity, this is the sample set of objectives that we would like you all to start thinking through some criteria today. Again, we can just get our feet wet with this and gladly accept further recommendations from you all in the coming weeks. But around these 3 objectives of equity, we don't know how the criteria should look, and so want you all to help inform how we evaluate creating a more equitable society. So I'll read out these 3 objectives, and I'll actually stop sharing my screen, and Colleen McHugh from the Water Institute will share hers, and we'll do some live note taking as with the climate equity definition, so that we can begin to think through and workshop what criteria might look like. And so some of our fundamental objectives for you all is around creating a more equitable society. So reducing socioeconomic, demographic, and geographic disparities in future opportunities and outcomes. And others, maximize reduction and mitigation of institutionalized harms to historically underserved and marginalized people and communities. And the last would be maximize engagement with and participation of communities in decision-making and implementation. And Colleen and I were trying to wordsmith some of the objectives as you all were working through that climate equity definition, which is very helpful, and I think segues quite well into this consideration on criteria. So just a few questions to keep in mind that I would frame are, what is a meaningful outcome? What are the most critical factors that need to be considered when we evaluate these objectives? And then what does success or failure in this objective look like? So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and Colleen, let you take over. And our chairwoman and I will lead you all through a discussion on those objectives.
Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
And please chime in if I've captured any of your comments incorrectly as we go.
And members, we can let you stew for a minute or two on considering what outcomes might be beneficial from these objectives that we framed significant in creating a more equitable society. And I think our system of hand raising has worked quite well, so we can wait on hands.
One more thing to just remind and frame for everyone on the fundamental objectives themselves is that they're all directional, right? So reduce or maximize, setting that direction so that we can measure outcomes of different things in terms of the extent to which they reduce or the extent to which they maximize. So as we think through criteria, sort of thinking through how will we know, what is the right qualitative or quantitative data or information to lean on as we understand whether these things, how these things move us on that spectrum.
Initial thoughts, members.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks for the few minutes, but I will say I feel like we could be more helpful if we had these materials in advance and had a little bit of time to review and reflect ahead of time. I just want to acknowledge that if there's any way we can do that going forward, I feel like our time together might be a little bit more productive.
And Liz, this is really just an opportunity to start the exercise and
Great.
Giving you guys a few weeks to continue that work on. I felt like it was helpful to wait and frame this in the context of the process instead of overloading you all with process information over email. But I do appreciate that and we will respect that.
So we're practicing here. This is the space, and the courage to speak right now is really just the courage to shoot your shot at practice, and nothing is nailed down right now. So let's give it a try. As we look at these objectives, what are some of the criteria that we want to make sure we're lifting up?
I'm not looking for, but like an employment rate. How will it affect the employment rate? Because usually the marginalized people, whenever your employment rate raised, marginalized groups will usually have higher numbers in unemployment than people that's not affected as much. So would that be a criteria? How it affect employment rate?
Yeah, I think that's a great start. If we want to see a reduction in socioeconomic disparities, we want to see an increase in the employment rate for marginalized communities. And we listed out some of those marginalized communities. We listed out Black, Brown, Indigenous, disabled, Asian, Fisher folk. So I think this is an important point. Thank you, Rodney. Great start. Great start. I don't know if you can see it, Mr. Rodney, but Colleen's taking notes, so it's listed on our screen now. So thank you. Others?
Also, to piggyback off of Rodney's comment, maybe we could add to that from a criteria perspective, even some of the contractors and subcontractors that will be awarded this work, maybe a certain percentage of those contractors must be from the group in which we are seeking to advance.
I hear that loud and clear. And the contractors, the folks who get the big contracts from, say, the state or the federal government to build or develop, let's see an increase in the number of marginalized folks who are getting those, procuring those contracts. Thank you, Jasmine. That's excellent. Yep, Dr. Colton.
I'm thinking back to when we saw this major increase in fuel prices in the 70s. First, it kind of jumped from 35 cents a gallon to 60, and then in the late 70s it went up to over $1, and everybody was completely shocked. And what you saw happening then was the people who could take advantage of buying these imported small gas conserving vehicles were able to make the transition. The old gas guzzlers ended up in the hands of the people who were least able to afford their upkeep and their gas. So how do we enable the transition to the new technologies that will come as part of this for people who can't afford to buy, a Tesla? And how do we make the technologies available to the people who need the most?
To make the new technologies accessible to some of the most marginalized people, to make those transition elements accessible to the most marginalized, prioritizing these folks, in fact.
And minimizing the costs.
And minimizing the costs.
Transition to the people who are least able to afford it.
Minimizing the cost of the transition to the people, for the people who are least able to afford it. I like that. I like that language. Okay. Thank you for that. I think that's excellent. If we think about this in a broad way, we're talking about major shifts, and we don't want the burden of these shifts to fall on the poorest people or the most marginalized people. That's what I'm hearing. And we've got many examples here, but yes. I think it also gets to that word in our definition around accountability, right? Who's bearing what burden? Excellent. Others?
Well, Madam Chair, the public health side of me is thinking along the lines of improving health outcomes. I just feel like whatever we do in this regard, we need to really strike a chord. We need to really turn. We need to really have some successes in improving health outcomes in our state.
Yes, and I such a great point, Charles. And in fact, this was even one of the questions from the larger task force, which is, how is the equity group really looking at health? Because that was another area that wasn't really talked about when we talked about the climate crisis and the reducing emissions. There's a piece here around public health and how do we improve those health outcomes? That as a criteria, I think definitely an important piece, especially given Louisiana's health data right now, right? And this gets to that broader vulnerable conversation. Like, it's not just one group of people in trouble in Louisiana, it's many of us health-wise. Thank you, Charles. Excellent addition.
Going back up to the top, so that first criterion, under employment rate, it's also kind of increased workforce participation from marginalized groups across all the sectors, right? The new public sector jobs, in the private sector, even in kind of nonprofit organized, kind of community leadership related to the transition that we're undertaking.
Yes. I think this, talking about the different sectors, so helpful, Ashley, because we're not just talking about one place. This is a broader societal approach. And the employment rate for a diverse state like Louisiana, I think this is really important. Thank you for bringing that in. I would mention here, conversations, federal conversations around a care economy, right? Many jobs and spaces that don't get even acknowledged. But as we've seen in COVID in particular, these workers that don't get counted as workers, but are doing work nonetheless. So thank you for that, Ashley. Others. And we can stay on this one. There are some other fundamental objectives as well. Please feel free to jump wherever your heart is singing to you. Liz, did I see your hand?
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I think for the second one, minimize industrial expansion adjacent to or adjacent to or within marginalized communities. I feel like there could be something more explicit in terms of emissions reduction there. However, I'm a little anxious about throwing it out because I feel like that could influence maybe some investment in technologies to reduce emissions that might mean more industrial expansion. So I'm kind of holding that tension.
But what I'm hearing more broadly is if we're gonna maximize reduction and mitigation of institutionalized harms to historically underserved and marginalized people and communities, then we want to minimize the industrial expansion of facilities and all of these things next to, within any kind of space of these communities. We don't want to put more burden on them with more industry.
I would say facilities and or like the infrastructure that supports those facilities, right? So there's logistics, infrastructure, and pipelines and
pipelines. Yeah.
So I think that's right, Madam Chair. I also wonder, there could be something here in terms of pollutants and toxins and minimizing emissions permitting. And sort of allowances for pollutions, toxins, and I wonder how that's built into an understanding of emissions reduction. I'm a little cautious about it too because of some of the solutions that could be proposed to do that.
And I think we do get to at least health hazards and unknown impacts, right? So even if we don't know, we know that there are consequences to everything we do, and so. Can we not have people have to prove the consequence, but have the industry have to prove a lack of consequence, right? Really sort of turning that accountability around. Thanks, Liz. Mr. Larry, I saw your hand. Are you able? There you go.
Yes, on the third one, participation of communities. I think a complete remake of the permitting process that we have in the state with industries coming into the communities, giving the local government more control and having more engagement from the local communities that's going to be impacted the most needs to be looked at.
I want to augment your having more participation to requiring more community participation. We're seeing that at the federal level, where there's a particular kind of engagement that has to be achieved before permitting and things can go forward. So I love that. I love that addition. Thank you, Mr. Larry. Excellent. We want this permitting process really to be something on the table. This is getting to what's next to these marginalized communities. It's getting to what's causing poor health. And also emitting greenhouse gases. So it's excellent. Thank you. Let's see. Anyone else want in? We're just giving it a try. It's just practice. We're just shooting the ball. We're just seeing where we go.
Hey, it's Steve. Under the first one, you could put it anyway. I mean, should we specifically have the category of we probably want a permitting process for any industry going forward formally requires environmental equity analysis or formally requires environmental justice analysis. Obviously, that would get built out over time, but actually require that as a part of permitting, period.
So in addition to understanding the environmental impact, which is often in these permitting processes, we need to understand what the equity impact is, what the environmental justice impact is going to be before things get permitted and allowed for. This is an
Maybe
excellent.
That's better in two rather than one. I don't know, but that just seems to me applicable.
Yes, probably in both economic and democratic. Yeah, maybe let's put that one in number 2, just because it's specifically talking about the mitigation. And this is where we already have some conversation around permits. Yes, thank you. Great addition. So we want to increase employment. We want to increase engagement in the workforce. We want to minimize the burden on folks and the cost, and maximize access to new technologies, improve health outcomes. This is great for number 1. Number 2, minimize industrial expansion, minimize emissions, impact analysis before we go forward on permitting. On number 3, we want to require more community participation, bring more local control. All right, I see some hands coming. Let's go to, we'll go Dr. David, Ashley, and then Dr. Colton.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is more of the question around philosophy more than any of these things, which is probably why I'm struggling here. Because I'm looking at these things, and it seems to me that perhaps we've accepted that eco-capitalism is a reality and it's not going anywhere. And we're not talking about conservation and healing of the land and other ways of economic development and transformation. And even the criteria, the way they're written, suggest that this thing isn't going away, right? But how do we reduce the impacts of the things that will be the economic drivers in that sense, with the focus on creation of jobs without taking into account the ecological limits of the land and the earth, especially in this state. And so I don't know where that goes. I just needed to say that I'm silent because I'm working through that in my head as a philosophical foundation, right?
Yeah.
That I don't necessarily agree with.
I love the comment and really appreciate it coming in here. And I think it's time for us to actually practice putting those types of criteria on the table. Healing the land. I mean, really thinking about land usage. I'm here in St. Tammany, and I'm just watching more and more development as we get more and more flooding. And I'm thinking to myself, what is it going to take for us to say our land can't take anymore? You know, what is it? What is that process? I think that criteria is important. We'd love to have some suggestions on how to put that in here for sure. And I think it does belong. It might look different from what we have written so far, but let's put it in. Let's give it a try. Healing the land. I don't want to take exactly your words, but healing the land, managing, assessing what the land can hold, ecological impact of development. I'm hearing all of that. We'll let you stew a little more, but we sure do welcome those comments. Let's go Ashley, Dr. Colton, and then Steve.
I just wanted to add on that third objective, kind of explicitly prioritizing decision-making, community decision-making. So beyond engagement, well, I guess it does say decision-making in the piece. I guess I want to figure out how we measure it like that. if we're building the criteria, I want to have a metric to go with that.
It's interesting because the federal definition for meaningful engagement is what came out several years ago. And I think it was really trying to get to that very point. How do we measure engagement? And there is actual words that say it doesn't just mean having a meeting and checking a box. Like it means, there's some more meat to that definition, I believe, out of the EPA on meaningful engagement of the community.
And
Thank you for that. Yeah.
Maybe we also just explicitly state governance as well, like inclusive governance as well. Push it beyond just the public meeting.
So as our own descriptive, that inclusive governance as a standard. I hear that. Thank you, Ashley. Let's go Dr. Colton and then Steve.
Thank you. One other item I'd like to have us consider for the first point up at the top, it does mention geographic disparities. And I think this will ultimately see a major transition going on as we shift to economic activities that are not based on fossil fuels. And how do we make sure those are equitably distributed around the state? How do we target economic opportunity across the state fairly?
And fair, if we go back to our definition of equitable, right? So how do we target economic opportunity equitably, and really sort of prioritizing some of those marginalized communities across the state, not just in the oil and gas region, but excellent addition. Let's go to Steve. And I'm not sure, Dr. David, if your hand is still up, or Liz, if your hand is still up, but we'll go Steve and then, okay, we'll go Steve, Liz, and then Mr. Rodney.
A sort of a broader comment about David's recommendations, which I like, but it probably goes to how we think about this. One of the, I think, sub-objectives that I saw flashing through the screen here was maximizing job growth, which is sort of captures exactly the existing economic development mentality that I think we want to challenge as a part of this conversation. And so there are, as Lindsay points out, there are other places to do that. But I think it is worth making sure that there is, at a minimum, a short-term, a temporal component of this, short-term versus longer-term. We have this tendency to make these decisions for yesterday and today, but not for tomorrow. And so I'm not exactly sure, as you can tell by the way I'm saying that, how to incorporate that into this this process. But it struck me very strongly reading the objectives that really just throws out the idea of any sort of balanced kind of approach to, particularly in a place like Louisiana that has the challenges that we have from a ecological perspective. So, well, that's enough. I'm just not sure if we can fit it into our space here, but we definitely should make sure that we do look at those other objectives in the process that we have here.
I'm really hearing an echoing of what Dr. Robinson Morris mentioned, this sort of assumption that we're just going to keep, that capitalism is the starting point and there can be no other way of looking at this thing, that, continued growth is the way to go with no real attention being paid to the limitations of our ecology, of our economy. So really hearing that, and this temporal component makes a lot of sense, especially in the climate conversation where we're dealing on a global clock here, but also shifting an entire economy, an entire community. So this is sort of some short-term must-dos with some long-term realities. So thank you for that, Steve. Excellent. Let's go Liz and then Mr. Rodney.
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I feel like my suggestion likely goes at the bottom with similar abstractness to what Steve just said. There's something rolling around in my brain around like the cost to Louisiana and to constituents in terms of investing for our future, and making sure that we are investing in a transition as opposed to continuing to sort of subsidize systems as they are, or the sort of status quo. And there's something, there's something about being able to measure the costs in a way that gives that long time span, and the benefits, even as much as I really struggle with traditional cost benefit analysis and the ways that those can be problematic. For me, there's something there around making sure that, like, the cost to Louisianans, that we're fully considering the cost to Louisianans in the way that we invest for our future, and which recommendations that we decide to support and how, or which portfolios we move forward and how. So I don't know what the language is. I just wanted to mention it.
Yeah. And considering the cost to Louisianians, like really, like, cost is not just financial costs, right? What do we value? How do we define what is valuable to us? Is our health, is our culture, is our land as valuable as, profit making? So that cost being a broader sense of the word. Yeah, thank you for that. Mr. Rodney?
With marginalized communities, how are you going to advertise this to them? Because, you can have a good job, but to the guy who don't have a job and don't know where to go and get that good job, your good job don't mean nothing. So, we have to be able to advertise this to people where they can go and find this or readily have this information.
And so I'm hearing, in order to really hit that objective number one, we need to make this accessible. We need to make, if we're actually going to reduce the disparities, we're going to have to make information about opportunities accessible, plentiful, not one commercial in one big area, but we need a spread of information, multitude of information sources that people use, not just TV and radio, but churches and word of mouth and libraries and things like that are in the community, so folks know where the opportunities are. I really appreciate you saying this, Mr. Rodney, because I think in Katrina and BP, I just remember so many situations where there were opportunities and you only got to know about it if you were connected to somebody who knew about it, and the people who would show up for the free training or for the opportunity, there was a real disparity in a broader participation. So thank you. We need this to be accessible. We need folks to know about it. We need those most marginalized folks to be prioritized in this knowledge and in this information. Excellent. Thank you for that. I believe we've made it through the hands. Lindsay, I'm not sure where we are on time. I just want to check in with you, but certainly want to get more folks to chime in as we have time to do.
How about we continue workshopping until 11:30? How does that work for numbers?
Okay, great. So let's take just about 9 more minutes here to continue cultivating some really good stuff. And as we've seen, even if it's not here, Colleen's been able to catch it for us and we'll figure out where it goes. So, let your light shine here, friends. Let's get some more good stuff on the board. One thing that comes to mind for me, and I'm not exactly sure where it goes. I think it goes in number 1, but it has to do with education. And I'm thinking about, as we make this transition, job training is one thing, but there's a whole transformation that has to happen within our education system for our next generations to be able to not just participate as workers, but to really participate in a new economy as thought leaders, as innovators. This requires access, information. And so I'm just thinking about our education system and the connection between our workforce and our education. And so I wanted to lift that up. Also a child of an educator, you know how that goes. My mama's watching, you know what I'm saying? So she taught in Louisiana for 40 years. I got to bring it up. So there's that part. you know, I brought up education. It's not quite on point. It's a little ancillary. I wonder if there are other things that folks are thinking about that might not be, you know, exactly jobs, or might not be exactly permitting, but they fit in our broader. If we think about these recommendations, they fit in our broader society: health, education, housing. I see we're missing something on housing, and you know, these things that we know are pillars. I wonder if anything's coming up for folks.
Madam Chair, as I hear you there, I'm thinking of my father, who's a retired educator and retired educational administrator. And in particular, he retired in the from the vocational technical system. And I feel as though we've got to ensure that investments are made in the vocational, or what do I want to call it? It speaks to me in the realm of how are we training our people to work in the renewable industries. Okay. We've got to make investments in that regard. And that's something my dad were sitting here right now, he would be speaking to that. So
That's right. That's right. No, I hear that loud and clear. The trades, right? There's a new trade. There's a new skill coming. Actually talking with Mr. Rodney, the folks at the IBEW, these unions that are, you know, seeing the shift, seeing the transition and offering the trainings. You know, how do we get those big investments? That's a big, I think that's huge. Investing in these trade schools, the job training programs. I think that's right. Thank you for that, Charles. Your dad would be proud. Great. Others. Yeah, Ashley?
I'm still thinking about this tension between capitalism as we know it and, you know, saving the planet. And it feels like another thing we should hold, you know, this proposed appendix thing is less about a glossary and more about the tensions or things that we need to really struggle with. Because I think what we don't want, you know, as folks are now starting to dream and imagine about a liberation economy, we don't want our traditional, you know, business folks to say, oh, well, you know, just when I was getting ready to have a more diverse workforce, they told me not to because we had to save the planet, right? And I don't want us to have, I want us to consider the unintentional consequences as we're wrestling with, you know, kind of what do we do now and next and later, but that feels like a really important tension. You know, lots of our business leaders around the country since last summer have been trying to figure out, you know, more diverse workforce and getting, you know, more people connected, Black people, Indigenous people, people of color connected to actually good jobs with living, you know, family sustaining wages. And I don't want to create a new excuse for why we shouldn't do that too. In the meantime, figure out what a liberation economy really is.
Really appreciating that. And, you know, thinking through, you know, many of the comments that I'm seeing by many leaders about why we should continue harmful action against the planet in order to get jobs, right? It's one or the other. It's this false choice. Capitalism never thrown on the table as something to consider, right? This economic philosophy never really put on the table as something that we should critique and or shift or change or eliminate. And I think that's what I was hearing Dr. Robinson really bring, that there's a tension here. We can try to just replace things as though the track is still good, but we could also acknowledge the track is bad, and that we should be flying in, you know, like that we should be doing this a whole different way. So really hearing that. Thank you for that.
I want to say it as clearly as I can. Okay. If I am struggling right now today, I lost my job and I'm not able to provide for my family, while the notion of a liberation economy or a replacement for capitalism is exciting, there's also an immediate need that I have that, while we're philosophizing, is not allowing me to feel like I'm providing for my family. And I just you know, all of it is, nobody's wrong, right? But I just want to, if we're representing everybody and all the voices, you know, people who are struggling right now in this moment, I just want to name that too.
Yeah. And I want to acknowledge one of the listings in the marginalized community was poor, and maybe, you know, poor and working poor, really getting some of that data that Jasmine mentioned, like what are we actually talking about? Like this is the poverty rate in Louisiana. This is who's out of work. This is who we're talking about. Let's make sure we're doing what Dr. Colton said, which is prioritizing some of these folks for some of these opportunities. But I hear that loud and clear. And this is actually a point we're going to struggle with in Louisiana because pre-COVID, pre-everything, we had an oil industry on the decline. We had unemployment rates that were really high. We had, you know, so we had our own economic struggles. Now we're putting this these visionary recommendations on top of folks who were already struggling. This will be a real issue. Dr. Robinson, did I see you come off, and did you want to come in on this one?
You did. Thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to say, Ashley, I acknowledge that point, right? That that there are some real operational realities that we have to grapple with around people's lives and livelihoods and holistic well-being, right? And so, you know, I think as an academic, I can hold two opposing thoughts, right? But it's kind of difficult sometimes for the general, and I don't want to generalize, right? But for the general public to hold those two opposing thoughts and try and find the middle ground in those thoughts and recognize that, listen, right now people are struggling and they just need jobs, right? And however they can get them, they need them to take care of their families. As policy folks, right, we're now thinking though, all right, this is not sustainable in the long term, right? So we're not talking about tomorrow, right? We're talking about perhaps 5 years from now. How do we begin to really transition and transform the economy into something that is more sustainable? It doesn't happen overnight, right? We didn't create this mess overnight, and we darn sure aren't going to clean it up overnight. But I think we have to begin to at least inject the idea into the conversation, right? And that's all that was. But you are very right. There are operational realities. People are suffering economically and otherwise, health-wise, all of those things, especially in this state, which is now number 50 in our health equity index, right? So how do we, as policy folks and as folks who are thinking this through, hold those two opposing thoughts, right? And make sure that we always keep them both in mind as we begin to track forward.
And in the interest of time, I really appreciate that as a closing thought, just as we continue to think through this criteria. Now, remember, this is our practice run. This is our time. This is the moment of thinking through. This is a little bit of a starting point. And I think what we heard Lindsay and the governor's staff really say is this is our moment to start thinking through what our final criteria really needs to be. Here, we've unearthed a lot of the conversation that we still need to have, that we still need to work through. And, you know, this conversation around transition in a place like Louisiana, that we're not transitioning in a state where jobs are good, health is good, people are good, and everything's good. We're transitioning in the midst of a lot of trauma, a lot of struggle, a lot of marginalization, historical and currently. And so we want to make sure that we're, you know, being honest and real about this. And there's a conversation here around economy, capitalism, labor. You know, there's one thing to create jobs. It's another thing to have a conversation, a re-conversation, a broader conversation around labor. Is it that people want to work in a job for another person, or is it that people want to have what they need to sustain themselves? These are not the same things. And we've got to be able to address that. But we did good, y'all. This is just a starting point. Everybody's mama is proud of them today, and daddies. They're good. They're proud of y'all for showing up today. And thank you. This was a really great start to the discussion. And thank you, Lindsay, for really kind of getting us through that. Let me turn it back over to you, Lindsay, just to take us to our next place.
Thank you, Chairwoman. And that, members, I do appreciate the very honest discussion from you all. That was very helpful and informative for us, even as thinking through these objectives and these starting to develop these criteria as well. So before we leave for today, I just wanted to frame some of the next steps for you guys, bringing back this slide that I had shown earlier of having about 2 weeks from today moving forward to work through any input that you all have across all of our criteria. And again, our goal is to create around 4 to 5 criteria for each objective across groups, but we understand there are a lot of considerations necessary in this conversation. So just as in our discussion today, I wouldn't necessarily limit you if you have a lot of ideas. We can work on synthesizing that on the back end. And then we will churn all of that around and synthesize into criteria for each of those objectives developed in this survey that I mentioned earlier that will go out to you all in mid-April alongside those hypothetical scenarios organized in their portfolios. Again, with the intent to provide a score for each of the portfolios against every objective and providing input in the form of short narratives of what might need to be considered or what are gaps in that portfolio or objective. And you guys will have about a month to do this, again, with that office hours time sandwiched in the middle, in case you have questions or would like to discuss this as we move forward. And just to revisit our list of objectives for you all, considering that equity is very important across all of the objectives that the task force has laid forth, we would appreciate you all evaluating all of these objectives or where you see that your expertise is best suited. So different members on this group might feel more comfortable evaluating certain objectives than others, but looking at the expertise you all have, I'm certain that across this group we can find people who are experts in helping us to do this evaluation for all of the objectives put forth. And then just to revisit our schedule for moving forward, we are moving towards that April cross-sector workshops next, where all of you will be assigned to one of the collaborative working sessions, and they'll be scheduled around a few days in mid-April, the 14th through the 16th. Colleen and I will have those dates to everyone, or those assignments to everyone by the end of next week, having about a 2-hour working session around certain broad themes and draft actions that would really benefit from a cross-disciplinary lens. And that's cross-sectorally bringing different committees together, but also bringing in your expertise as advisory members. So just trying to shake things up a little bit and make space for that cross-pollination and have some more working sessions. And again, they'll all be recorded in case there are sessions you're interested in that you are not able to attend. And with that in mind, I noticed even in the discussion of criteria today, you all had some really great action ideas of cross-cutting implementation priorities around climate equity and economic transition, scientific advancement, governance, and finance. You all have a very unique position cutting across all of those different sector groups, and we would appreciate if you all put forth some specific actions that might represent that well. And even as we begin to consider criteria, I think that might give rise to considering actions as well. And just a reminder that this process is going on through the end of April. We do have a template and a Google form for submitting a proposal, but it is a very comprehensive template, and there's no need or expectation that you will fill out every single question that there is, but more so creating the space to really provide some thorough analysis where it is available on the actions put forth. And so those are all of the next steps that I framed. If there are no questions, I'll hand it back over to our chairwoman.
Great. Well, I know we're gonna see if there are any public comments, but I just want to say what we engaged in today was hard. We are trying to, you know, as they say on The Sound of Music, pin the wave on the sand, and it's not easy. But we're in a new time, y'all. We're in a new day. It's important for us to have not only standards, but a definition of equity and how it can be applied and a real world understanding of what we're talking about and who we're talking about, especially when it comes to the great state of Louisiana. It's important for us to practice now how we build out criteria and really unearth a lot of the discussions that we have to have in order for this advisory group to come to its own conclusion, because the recommendations are going to be sifted through our lens. And so this was great work. It's not easy. It hasn't really been done before. Certainly hasn't been done with such an urgent issue on the table. So this is good. And I know that even the Lord, when the Lord says it is good, it is good. You know what I'm saying? I just want you to know I was hearing it was good. So good job. And I think, Lindsay, I'm not sure if we have any public comment yeah.
Yeah, I'll check for us right now. And we do have a few attendees on the webinar. So if there are any comments and anyone would like to speak, please just raise your hand on the webinar and we will invite you in. While we're waiting on that, I will also check our climate email and just make sure we don't have any written comments.
Great, thank you. And I saw Dr. Colton had to leave a little early and said this was a great discussion. Really appreciated it. And I see a little amen from Jasmine. Thank you. And I saw the spirit hand raised from Charles. I know it went down because I saw it happen. So so this is really good. And you know, we want to make sure that we bring in Chief Sherelle Parfait Dardar, who is again representing the tribe in a federal matter today, and bring in some of our other members into the conversation. So we've got some good notes. We've got a recording on YouTube that folks can go back to and really listen to, and we'll use that as we build out and go forward. Let's see if we have any comments.
We have not received any comments to our climate email nor attendee hand raises. I'll do one last call.
Excellent. Well, you know, if the public hadn't yelled at us, you know, that means we're on the right road here. They're telling us to keep cooking and keep simmering. But we do want to invite the public and those of you who will watch this in a recording to please send any comments you have to the climate email. I forgot exactly what the climate email is, but I know we have one. But maybe
climate@la.gov.
Climate@la.gov. Yes. Why did I forget that? Anyway, climate@la.gov. We want to welcome that. This advisory group welcomes feedback from the community. We encourage it and we look forward to it. The governor's staff is always sending us the public comments, and so we can see even after the fact if you have something to contribute, and we just want to make sure you know you're a part of this as well. So thank you so much for those who are watching and for those who will be commenting later. And thank you so much to the advisory group members. A morning well spent. All we were missing was some strong coffee. But if everyone's getting on the vaccine train, I feel like we're going to get coffee together sometime soon. And I'm really looking forward to it. My thanks to the governor's staff. Lindsay, great job and great work again, as usual. All right, I think we can officially adjourn. It is 11:41 Central Time, and we shall adjourn this meeting until our next meeting. All right.
Thanks, Colette.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Great
job.
Thank you, Governor staff. Appreciate everybody.
Right. Thank y'all. Peace.